Hey everyone, welcome to class. Today we'll be exploring a new paint medium, acrylic paint. The last two lessons, we learned about watercolor paint and explored watercolor's unique attributes and techniques. Many of the same principles we learned will apply to our lesson on acrylic, so be sure to watch the watercolor episodes before continuing with this lesson. Acrylic paint is a water-based medium similar to watercolor, which means we'll be using water to thin the paint and wash our brush. Although acrylic shares its water-based principles with watercolor, they're very different mediums, and as we learn how to use this medium, that difference will become more apparent. One of the major differences is that acrylic is considered an opaque medium, meaning if we paint over another color, the new layer of paint will completely cover over the layer underneath it. This means that we can paint dark colors over light colors, and we can also paint light colors over dark colors. This is possible because acrylic paint is much thicker than watercolor, and because acrylic sits on top of the surface that it's painted on, opposed to watercolor, which soaks into and stains the paper. Because acrylic doesn't soak into the surface it's on, we can apply it to many different surfaces, such as canvas, wood, and many kinds of paper. Another major difference between watercolor and acrylic is that once acrylic is dry, it cannot be reactivated with water. Most watercolor sets are made up of dried watercolor pigments. And as we saw in the previous lessons, we can activate the dried watercolor pigments with water. And even after our painting is finished, we can rub out and lift the pigment with a damp brush or napkin. Acrylic, on the other hand, will come in a thick liquid form that can be squeezed out onto our palette. Once it's dry for good. Acrylic in its dry form is a water-resistant plastic, so make sure you don't get it on your clothes. The differences of opacity and reactivity to water will have a major impact on how we treat and use watercolor and acrylic paints. Today, we're going to learn some of those unique principles of acrylic and gain a foundation in how to use the medium. Here's what you'll need for today's lesson. You'll need watercolor paper, a palette or a paper plate, your acrylic paints, a napkin, a cup of water, a flat brush, a pencil, and a ruler. Like our previous lessons, we'll be dividing our paper into two sections using our ruler and pencil. Once we're finished with our line, we can put our ruler away since we won't need it for the rest of the lesson. Similar to our first lesson on watercolor, we'll be using these two sections to look into the basics of mixing and applying acrylic paint, and brush and edge control. Let's start with mixing and applying our paint. First, you may have noticed that the flat brush we're using is a different shape than our round watercolor brush. Although we can use a round brush for acrylic or a flat brush for watercolor, the different brush shapes will give you different advantages when painting. For acrylic, since it's a thicker medium, the flat brush allows us to scoop up our paint. Since watercolor is very fluid, the round brush allows us to hold a lot of liquid within the bristles. You can experiment with different brush types for your paintings, but if you know how to use a good round brush and flat brush, you should be able to paint just about anything. In visual arts, especially in painting, the tool will most likely not be your most limiting factor, and to rely on particular tools to create effects will limit you more than help you. This is why we emphasize practicing good foundational skills. That will give you the widest range of opportunity. So now that we know a little bit about why we're using a flat brush, let's put out some paint and learn how to use it. Since acrylic paints come in a liquid form, each time we set up our acrylics, we have to put out new paint on our palette. For today, I'll be using a metal palette, but if you don't have a palette, a paper plate will work as well. When setting up our palette, we want to put out fresh paint on the edge of our palette so that we have space to mix paint in the middle. The more you paint, the more you'll get a feel for how much paint to put out for each painting session. Keep in mind we can always put out more, but we can't or shouldn't rather put paint back into the tube. Let's put out our primary colors: yellow, blue, and red. For our first exercise, let's look at loading our brush and applying the paint to our paper. The first step is to scoop up some paint from one of our colors. The best practice for this is to scoop from the edge of our paint pile and not from the center. This will allow us to better control how much paint we're using and help keep our paint piles clean. Even though we will not be mixing any other colors into our paint for this first exercise, we want to first lay the color we'll use on our palette before we bring it to our paper. Similar to watercolor, we'll use our palette to mix colors, control the consistency of the paint, and load our brush. As you lay the paint on the palette, we can do a few things. First, we can check the consistency of the paint by mixing it with our brush. We may notice that the paint is too thick for our liking. If this is the case, we can add water to thin down the paint. If you add too much water to acrylic paint, it will lose its opaque properties and will become transparent. So be aware that the amount of water you use will affect how opaque or transparent acrylic will be. We may also notice that the paint is clumpy. This can happen when the binder separates from the pigment. If this is the case, we can smooth out any clumps of pigment. Once we're satisfied with the consistency of the paint, we can squeeze the paint out of our brush and onto the palette by pressing down on the brush and dragging it. After we squeeze most of the paint out, we can load our brush by scooping up the desired amount of paint onto the tip of our flat brush. This is an important step if we want to be able to control the brush well. Without this step, our brush can become thick with paint that is built up near the ferrule of the brush. This is not good for our brush shape while painting and can make washing our brush more difficult. Now that we have our brush loaded, let's use the wide side of our brush to make a broad stroke. Pull the brush along the paper to make your stroke, similar to how we pulled our watercolor brush. Acrylic is not as fluid as watercolor, so the paint won't stretch as far. We can observe this the same way that we saw in watercolor by seeing the edge of our stroke begin to break up and become jagged. A broken up stroke is not a bad thing and is often desired in acrylic painting. We'll cover this in the next episode. For now, if we want a clean edge, a broken up stroke is a clear indicator that we need to reload our brush. Let's go ahead and reload our brush and make a new line, using the thin blade of our brush to create a thin stroke. Similar to the round brush, we can achieve different line weights by changing how the brush is applied to the paper. Understanding how to load our brush and apply the paint to the paper is a simple concept that is easy to understand but takes a lot of practice to achieve consistent results. In addition to controlling our brush, getting a good feel of how much paint to mix, how much water to add, and how much paint to load requires a lot of practice and time painting. Without these skills, it's very difficult to predictably improve your paintings. So don't overlook the value and practice of these seemingly simple exercises. Now, let's move on to the next exercise on the bottom half of our paper, where we're going to explore mixing colors and edge control. First, let's draw two shapes that overlap each other with our pencil. These shapes can be any shape, just make sure they're not too small. Also, make sure to keep at least 1 inch of border between our shape and the edge of our paper. Now that we have our shapes for our exercise, let's look into mixing colors with acrylic paint. Mixing colors can easily be one of the more challenging aspects of painting, so let's look at some simple tricks to simplify the process. First, we want to be conscious of how much paint we'll need to fill in a given shape. It can be really frustrating to spend time mixing the perfect color just to run out and have to mix it all over again. This is inevitable early on in our painting experience. So the best thing to do is to accept that it'll happen and see it as an opportunity to learn how to arrive at the color you want consistently. Once we calculate how much paint we'll need, we should look into the makeup of our desired color. Typically, every color in our painting will be made up of at least one other color, and possibly tinted or shaded with white or black. We'll be covering tinting and shading in the next episode. Once we know which colors we need to mix to make up the color we want, we need to figure out which of those colors are stronger and weaker. This will determine which color acts as the base color that we'll add the other color or colors into. An important factor to keep in mind is that each color can be different between brands and quality of paint. So a strong color for one brand may differ significantly from another brand. When first starting with acrylic, it's good to commit to one brand of decent quality paint and to learn the ins and outs of the medium with that particular brand. For the acrylic in our suggested materials list for the foundation series, phthalo blue is a very strong color. Cadmium red would be the second strongest color, and cadmium yellow would be the weakest. This particular brand of acrylic tends also to be on the thinner side, which means that the color is more transparent even when painted thickly than other brands of higher quality. All these things will need to be taken into account when mixing our paint. So let's mix a green color, which we'll use to fill in the leftmost shape on our exercise to see how the strength of color applies in our mixing process. To make green, we're going to mix yellow and blue, but because the strength of those pigments with this brand are not equal, we'll use the weaker color as the base color. For example, the weaker color is yellow. One reason why we start with the weaker color is to control the amount of paint we'll use. A small amount of a stronger color can greatly affect the weaker color, so we'll be using more of the weaker color, and this will give us a better estimate of the amount of paint we need. It will take less blue to change the overall color than yellow. Start by scooping your desired amount of paint from the edge of our yellow paint pile and place it down in an open area on your palette. Next, we can wash out our brush, dry our brush, and scoop up our blue. We want to scoop a small amount of paint at first to see how much it influences our color before adding more. Another helpful tip is to mix the color from the edge and not from the center. This is helpful if we mix too much of our strong color, since we can always take the paint out. If we start mixing from the center, we're committed to the amount we added. You can add more of the strong color as needed, but remember to add this color in small amounts. Once you have your green color, go ahead and fill in the far left shape. We'll use the same steps we followed when painting with watercolor, starting with the edges and working our way to the middle, and making sure the tip of our brush is against the edge of our shape. Once you're finished filling in this shape, go ahead and mix two new colors and fill in the two other shapes. Focus on mixing your colors and keeping the edges of your shape clean. Now that we're finished with filling in our shapes, we're going to practice cleaning up our edges. For this, we'll use our white paint. Go ahead and put a small amount of white paint out on your palette. Mix it on your palette, but don't use much water because we want our paint to be as opaque as possible. Let's use the white to paint a clean edge all the way around the edge of our three shapes. The best way to do this is to paint over the edge slightly so that we're covering the edge of our shape. You may need to do a second layer in order to fully cover the edge of the shape, but that will depend on the quality of paint you're using. Next, let's mix more colors and paint designs and shapes over the big shapes we just painted in. Again, pay attention to your brush control and edge control so that we have nice clean shapes. This will allow you to see the opaque nature of acrylic and give you more practice with your brush and edge control. Acrylic is an incredibly versatile medium with great potential for control and finesse. I'm sure throughout this lesson, you were able to see how acrylic differs in technique and feel from watercolor. In the next episode, we'll be exploring some techniques to really get the most potential out of the acrylic medium. These techniques will require us to be comfortable with mixing colors and controlling our brush and edges, so make sure to practice what we learned today. Remember, don't underestimate the importance of these seemingly simple exercises. And keep in mind that the more you paint, the better you'll understand and get a feel for the medium. I'll see you in the next class.